Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to my channel, Analyze This, Mr. Bond, where I discuss the adventures of fictional super spy James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. Today we are talking about License to Kill in part 2 of my two-part series about the Timothy Dalton era. As I noted in my prior video on The Living Daylights, Timothy Dalton is my favorite James Bond, but License to Kill is very far from my favorite James Bond movie. It seems to be the case with Bond fans that when it comes to Timothy Dalton, you're either a Living Daylights person or a License to Kill person. I'm very much a Living Daylights person and not a License to Kill person for reasons we'll discuss in this video. But I have to admit, License to Kill holds a very unique place in the Bond film franchise. It has a unique texture, a unique feeling, that sort of Miami Vice quality that often gets discussed in reviews when License to Kill is put under the microscope, gives it a very unique character, much like Live and Let Die feels so distinct from the rest of the Bond film canon. Unfortunately, it's so different in feel from The Living Daylights that it actually makes Dalton's tenure feel a little schizophrenic. A third film would really have unified his era, especially if it had been GoldenEye, which would have felt like it really encapsulated everything his Bond represented. As much as I'm glad we got GoldenEye with Pierce Brosnan, there would have been a thematic level of appropriateness for Dalton to have done GoldenEye, and it would have nicely carried forward from the starting point of his era with The Living Daylights. But we got the two films that we got. I'm glad we got both of them. I think Timothy Dalton is terrific in this film, even if I think License to Kill is a bit unworthy of Timothy Dalton. Dalton's Bond in The Living Daylights is a darker character. He's a professional. He is an intelligent professional who has been in the trade for quite a long time, and when we meet him again in License to Kill, that impression stands. He is still the professional Bond. He is a dark-edged Bond, a Bond who is not afraid to be ruthless, but is also, at times, capable of being tender and romantic, and we see those facets explored in License to Kill in a way that is perhaps less satisfying. The Living Daylights allowed Dalton to explore more shades of his Bond in terms of how well developed the romance element is in Living Daylights compared to his sort of darker spycraft sequences in that film, and sometimes they're occupying the same space, such as like Living Daylights sequence in Vienna during the carnival, where Bond is shifting back in and out of this romantic mode into the spy professional mode and kind of navigating all these different facets. License to Kill gives Bond a revenge story. In many ways, we've gotten used to this now, that every Bond film effectively has to have some sort of personal angle for Bond, but License to Kill was the first Bond film to do that. It was the first, this time it's personal, James Bond film. And in finding that angle, it's going back to Ian Fleming. License to Kill is cobbled together from a number of Ian Fleming stories. It's using unused material from License to Kill. It's using story material from the Hildebrandt Rarity. That stew is actually pretty potent. I think the setup here that Bond is avenging his friend Felix Leiter feels fairly strong and exciting, and builds on the Fleming legacy in a way that's potentially very interesting. I think what is missing here is a sense of calibration. There's something non-committal about the way the film pursues that revenge story. Not for Dalton's Bond himself, who has the conviction you would expect from Bond. I think Dalton's Bond gets some terrific moments here, and we'll talk about some of those, but one of the really good signature moments for Dalton's Bond, I think, is the moment he somewhat nonchalantly quits the service with a farewell to arms, as he quips. That's a very literary reference in keeping with Dalton's Bond, who is very culturally savvy, is more intellectual than some of his predecessors and successors in his cultural reference point. So that moment feels quintessentially Dalton's Bond. But what we don't get to see as much of as the way this story unfolds is that sort of rich dynamic with characters. When this movie allows Bond to really be in the space with people and really play against them, it works very well, which is one reason Sanchez is such a terrific villain for Timothy Dalton's Bond, because Sanchez is ruthless, much as Dalton's Bond is, but Sanchez also has such intelligence and presence. He's a real threat for Bond. There's a feeling that Sanchez really could get one over on Bond, even though Sanchez is not a mega supervillain. When we talked about The Living Daylights that Dalton's foes tend to be a little bit more real-world situated. These are not the dramatically fantastical villains of the series past, or even of the Ian Fleming novels. These characters have a slightly more grounded background. They feel like they come from an exaggerated but still recognizable world. They are career criminals to match Bond's career spy nature in these movies. Sanchez is a really interesting riff on that. Obviously, the sort of drug kingpin archetype had been well established even by the time of License to Kill. So this type of character wasn't, particularly novel. But Sanchez has such wonderful menace thanks to Davi's performance and the energy that the character has, and also the way the character is framed as a fairly intelligent businessman. I think that's the aspect of this movie that I love the most, is Bond versus Sanchez. When they're in a room together and Bond is manipulating him and Sanchez is pressure testing Bond, and Bond is kind of working his way through all of Sanchez's henchmen to cast doubt on them, and Sanchez is starting to spiral. That whole dynamic works really well in this movie, and it's a perfect dynamic for Dalton's Bond, who is, as I've noted in The Living Daylights, perhaps the most intelligent Bond, the one who feels like a real strategist. It is a delight to see Dalton's Bond face off against a foe where he is not just out to take the guy down, but is kind of taking down the guy's entire operation piece by piece. It's a good dynamic. Unfortunately, the movie takes a little too long to get to there. I think the movie sparks once Dalton's Bond and Sanchez get in a room together and start talking. That scene where Bond essentially offers his services to Sanchez, as well as the preceding casino activities, feels like really strong Bond material. Unfortunately, the story takes a bit of time to unfold. The opening sequence with Felix Leiter, who is a nice character here, a different Felix Leiter than we saw in The Living Daylights, kind of unfortunately interrupts the feeling that this is an established relationship. But I will say Dalton's Bond and Leiter here really do feel like they have an appropriate kinship. And while I don't necessarily love the character of Della, I think it brings out some very tender aspects in Dalton's Bond as well. The reference to Tracy and On Her Majesty's Secret Service is very discreetly handled, and Dalton plays that very well. I think from the start, though, you're starting to see a sort of tonal mishmash. The Living Daylights played with comedy and darker touches too, but it wasn't as schizophrenic as it sometimes feels in License to Kill. There was a little bit more organic shifting in and out of modes in The Living Daylights. The Living Daylights still could have used some refinement on that point, don't get me wrong, but License to Kill, because it exaggerates Bond's violence to such a great degree. I mean, it is still in many ways the most violent Bond movie even after the Daniel Craig era. It feels particularly jarring alongside some of the jokier Bond aspects. And this opening sequence with Bond on his way to Leiter's wedding, it doesn't quite convey the tension that it should. And I think Dalton is always fully committed. He's such a professional actor. But in some ways, I don't know that the setup really zeroes in on his character in the way that I wish it would. In part because that relationship, I don't know, that there's something missing when Della in particular is murdered. Dalton sells the anguish over this, but the movie doesn't really let the fate of Felix Leiter and his wife hang over the movie in the way that it certainly would if they were to do that storyline now. Even by the end of the movie, they're kind of, Bond's reconnection with Felix is a little jokey. You feel this sort of discomfort with the darkness of the story that the movie is continually pulling back from towards like a classic Bond jauntiness, and I really wish it could just commit to it. If this went full, full hard-edged, die-hard feeling, in some ways I feel like it would really, really connect. And certainly Timothy Dalton is game for it. I think one of the better aspects of this movie is the way it allows Timothy Dalton's Bond to be a little bit more bloodthirsty than he was in The Living Daylights. In The Living Daylights, he's pursuing a job. There's a bit of a revenge element there that creeps into the story when, he loses his colleague. But in this story, he is focused on a mission. There's a sort of relentlessness that creeps into his personal relationships in this movie, too. I think his allies in this movie tend to be a weak point, and that's unfortunate because his relationships with his allies in The Living Daylights are generally pretty well nuanced, with his relationship with Saunders. The relationship with Kara, I know some folks have some issues with the way Kara develops as a character over the course of that movie, but that romance in The Living Daylights is really thoughtfully developed from the start. In this film, we have Lupe and we have Pam Bouvier, and Pam's character, she doesn't have a lot of chemistry with Dalton's Bond. There's not any sort of believable sparks there, and B, her character is very thinly written. There's not a lot of strong rationale for her being part of the story beyond her just kind of like hanging out, having some attachment to Dalton's Bond. There's a notional motivation for her to be in the picture, but there's no real story for her character that can really interlock with Bond's in a meaningful way. Lupe is a little different. Her story is potentially very interesting. I mean, she is Sanchez's girlfriend in a very abusive relationship, and potentially the dynamic she would have with Bond could be really interesting. It would feel really charged with the sort of same energy that Andrea Anders has in the film The Man with the Golden Gun, or potentially, potentially they could have pulled more directly from the Hildebrandt Rarity in the way they shaped her character. I think it's a missed opportunity that she's in the film as briefly as she is. Because I think that relationship could have been a more interesting, dramatic crux for Dalton's Bond, especially since Dalton's Bond has the capability to be so protective of women in a way that feels very, not very, very genuine. Despite his occasional ruthlessness with them, that dynamic just feels very underexplored here. And in general, that's one reason that whole opening section of this story feels a little disorganized. It's because Dalton's Bond, as he's doing his investigation on his own, as he's left to his own resources, we don't get a lot of the really great, thoughtful little set pieces where we're seeing Dalton's Bond put things together in ways that are really sophisticated and interesting. Certainly, there's nothing on the level of the build-up in The Living Daylights, where you're kind of watching him enter into this conspiracy. He's helping someone defect, and then figuring out how fake it is, and then is trying to investigate next layers of that. You kind of get that with him figuring out what's going on with this, the drug ring, tracing it back to Crest. But that whole thing, it's just a little bit more perfunctory. There isn't a really, truly great moment that comes out of that whole set piece until he's water skiing with the money away from Crest's boat. I mean, that sequence is terrific for Dalton. I love, and we don't really get a lot of moments like this for Bond in general, just his sheer delight when he realizes when he's up in the plane how much money he has behind him, and he kind of like the kind of exuberant reaction there is very unique. It's very unique for Dalton. It's one of my favorite Bond character moments in the entire series. There's also a slight oddness in this movie in the way that Dalton's Bond, while he felt very modern in The Living Daylights, he still felt very quintessentially British. There's a sense in which this License to Kill loses a little bit of sight of the Britishness of the character in the midst of his surroundings. He does it. He dresses like an American. He moves like an American. You're not really getting this sort of cultural dynamic that could be really interesting. That is like this, Brit against the American DEA and that whole sort of cultural scene, what the cultural tension might be there, what it might be between Bond and this sort of like drug lord empire. It doesn't really play into that in any way, and it seems like a missed opportunity, because one of the things that's so fun about Live and Let Die, which again is another drug story, about gangsters pushing drugs, in a fictional country, right? So like there are a lot of parallels here with Live and Let Die, with a religious cover up for like cover story to kind of like disguise drug operations. I mean, the parallels with Live and Let Die just keep going. You get such a strong emphasis on Bond being this British character who's out of water. License to Kill kind of misses an opportunity to play with that a little bit, and it's unfortunate, because I think Dalton's Bond is really fun when he's, in The Living Daylights you get such nice moments that kind of emphasize Bond's cultural sophistication relative to those around him, and in License to Kill you're not really getting as much of that. He's just getting his hands dirty, he's getting in the mix with things. But I do want to generally compliment the film on the idea of this broader drug organization having all these different characters in it: Truman Lodge, Milton Crest, and especially Wayne Newton appearing as this quasi-televangelist in this. I think that's a really fun idea, and if anything, that whole section of the movie comes so late that it feels really underdeveloped. Again, there's this sense that Dalton's Bond has always had his best when he's kind of working off of people, reading people, manipulating people. He's doing that a lot in The Living Daylights, where he's always, striking bargains or kind of navigating his way around people. In this movie, he's not doing as much of that. The plot is a little bit more A to B, but when he is really doing that, it's really fun. And there's an interesting dynamic with the villains here, in the sense that they all have their particular lane, and it unfolds so quickly that it feels underdeveloped. Like the whole thing with the Stinger missiles feels like it kind of came out of nowhere. It's not doing a strong strong. It's not a strong subplot, really, and that is the aspect of this movie that just kind of leaves me wanting the most. Is I think there's a really terrific Bond movie to still be made about Bond infiltrating a villain's organization and just destroying it from the inside out. I have always wished that that's kind of what Quantum of Solace had been, that Bond would take on the identity of one of those agents and just kind of work his way through the ranks of the Quantum organization under a false name, just kind of laying waste to it out of revenge for Vesper's death. Like, that's the kind of movie I really wish License to Kill was, and it is in bits and spurts, but it's not consistently. That said, I appreciate touches here in the way Dalton's Bond does get to express some of those elements that I've said are understated. One of the best moments for his character in this movie is when he is looking to take out Sanchez with his handprint authenticated sniper rifle, which Q brings him. I really love that gadgetry. Again, Dalton's attitude towards gadgetry is it's very much professional equipment for him, and you get that in this movie to the sense that he's just very comfortable using this. He doesn't treat them as toys. They're not playthings. They just are true tools of the trade, and he is a deft hand at using them. And that sequence kind of pulls that together, but also pulls this idea that Dalton's Bond really is at core an assassin, and that was something that the Living Daylights set up. Living Daylights sets up Bond as a sniper very strongly. In this movie, we get another sniper sequence. There's a sense in which Dalton's Bond is uniquely the sniper Bond, and I love. Dalton is the only one who really could do the like watch the birdie line with the level of venom that he does. It kind of matches onto the line you get in the Living Daylights where he's like, enough time to make strawberry jam of him. Like that sort of. They're not your typical Bondian one-liners. There's almost something. I don't know. They are a thinking man's kind of remark, and that's why it feels so suited to Dalton, who is the most intellectual of these Bonds. I really do like, in the end, how Bond and Sanchez tangle together. I mean, again, their sort of energy together is the heart of this movie and is the most compelling piece of this movie, and they get a great final scene. The use of the lighter Bond was gifted. Felix lighter, an actual lighter, it's a bit of a gag, but I love the kind of ruthlessness of it. And, Dalton's Bond, like, don't you want to know why? And Sanchez just being somewhat baffled by what's happened to his entire organization. That element is very dramatically compelling, and it's a nice counterpoint to how limp the villain confrontations are in the Living Daylights for the most part. That gives you that really good thrill. And in general, I like the tanker chase too. It's a little jokey for the tone of the movie. Again, I think some of those like more humorous flourishes worked a little better in the Living Daylights, where the tone isn't as hard hitting. Here in License to Kill, there's a sense of that slightly more like schizophrenic edge to how the tone is working in this movie, but it's not very common for the Bond movies to just fully end with like a vehicular action sequence, and it works really well as a climax. I think Bond movies should consider doing that sort of big vehicular set piece as a climax again, and it's done with good stunt work. Dalton's Bond, we haven't really talked about his physicality as Bond, but in many ways he was the first Bond to advertise himself as the Bond who does his own stunts. In many ways, Dalton's Bond is the Daniel Craig's Bond before there was Daniel Craig's Bond, and Dalton's Bond has that sort of wonderful physicality in the action set pieces that Dalton is really bringing in his own sense of commitment. Finally, the final scene of this movie reframes how much Dalton's Bond really is the tender romantic of the series. I think it worked a lot better in The Living Daylights than it does in License to Kill. Again, I don't think his relationship with Pam Bouvier is very well established, and I don't think the tenderness in their romance is at all earned. But you see a sort of unabashed romance for Dalton's Bond that is very unique to his Bond. The sort of like leap into the pool, the final lines of the movie, it's strangely dissonant tonally in the context of the movie, given that this has been a dark revenge story. The ending of License to Kill is perhaps the weakest final minutes in any Bond movie. I mean, the winking fish that closes the movie is among the worst visual gags the series has offered, which is saying something given how the series has developed over the years. But Dalton's Bond is really, like Fleming's Bond, this true mix of sentimental romantic and ruthless career professional with a fatalistic edge. And that cocktail is thrilling. It's a shame Dalton didn't get to do a third one. He's my favorite Bond to watch, even in this movie, where I think there are so many sequences that don't serve him that well. There are many sequences that do, and when he's electric, the movie is electric. So a third Bond movie, if it had really been on point, it had really focused on what makes Dalton's Bond exciting to watch, his ability to solve puzzles, his ability to manipulate others, his ability to navigate complex scenarios and find solutions to them, could have been really thrilling. There are very few entries in the series where Bond gets to really play a strong strategist. And you have to give License to Kill credit for letting Bond do what he does to Sanchez's organization. That sort of storyline really hasn't been attempted again since, and is unique to Dalton's Bond. So, gotta give credit for at least trying something different. As much as I think License to Kill on the whole is probably one of the weakest Bond films, though I know many of you admire it. So if you do, by all means, let me know in the comments. But we're generally here to discuss Dalton's Bond. Dalton's Bond, in retrospect, even in these two movies, just feels like such a seasoned vet of the Secret Service that this film can let him quit the service, and it feels like it has weight. It feels like it carries organically in some ways from The Living Daylights, where he has his offhanded remark about how if M fires him, he'll thank M for it. That character element for Dalton's Bond feels very consistent. He's a professional, but he's not. He doesn't romanticize his job. He knows he's a working professional in a field of professionals. He's focusing around real-world tangible threats. He doesn't glamorize his own work, but he has a sort of ferocious dedication to it. And alongside that, you have this wonderful aptitude for sentimentality and romance. You have this sort of breadth of cultural knowledge. No other Bond that we've had has ever seemed as quite culturally sophisticated as Dalton's Bond, as culturally not knowledgeable, because Roger Moore's Bond could express great knowledge of strange minutiae, but Dalton's Bond seems like he takes an active interest in intellectual pursuits in a way that other Bonds do. And similarly, you know, is his appetite for life is kind of channels from that, and that feels like to me a bit of very Fleming-esque, in the sense that not necessarily the full-on intellectual qualities of Dalton's Bond, which feel very unique to Dalton, but the sense that Bond's zest for life is a facet of his interest in the world. Fleming's Bond is a character who we get to know through mostly an almost internal monologue. We have access to his thoughts. We are directly fed the way that Fleming's Bond is fascinated by the world around him, is fascinated by culture and the people that inhabit it. Dalton's Bond feels like he has that real Fleming curiosity. So as we look and wrap up this discussion of Dalton's Bond, it just feels so inarguable to me that when you read the Fleming novels, Dalton's Bond isn't essentially that character, or the closest to it, in terms of capturing all the contradictions of Fleming's Bond, the extremes of Fleming's Bond. He captures the hard-edged touches and the sentiment, and for that he is to be greatly commended. He's woefully underappreciated, in my opinion. Even without a third movie, I think the two movies he gave us left a pretty significant mark on the series and remain fairly unique entries in the canon to this day. So, that's my take on Timothy Dalton's Bond. I hope you've enjoyed it. Let me know what you think about Timothy Dalton's Bond, both films, in the comments, but primarily License to Kill, since that's what we're talking about in this video. And I will catch you in the next one.